Good afternoon again for week 6 of our study on the life and teaching of Jesus. I would like to talk just a tiny bit about schedule here at this point, and I'd like to get your permission on something. It was my intention to save week 7 for a more thorough study of some of the sermons of Jesus. And I looked at the material that we still have remaining before us for week 6 and week 7. And I determined that there's no way in the world that I would be able to cover all that material tonight and then add the sermon analysis to week 7. So with your permission, what I'd like to do is to take this week and next week and talk this week about the events of the last week up to and including the crucifixion. And then next week talk about the resurrection appearances. And that would mean that we would put off the discussion of the sermons of Jesus, discourses of Jesus, for some other time, perhaps a future class, because I didn't want to short this material because it's too important, and I didn't want to just try to rush through it all in an hour and a half. We can't do it. I can't do it. I should say it that way. I can't do that. Now, I've revised that so that you can see right there, revised more on the resurrection events. Now, I do want to get your permission on that. Is that okay with you guys if we do that? We do the crucifixion up to the crucifixion tonight, and next week we will do the resurrection, post-resurrection events, and we'll talk about them. I was thinking out loud, or to my wife, who doesn't care much one way or the other what I do with this kind of thing, but and also thinking to myself, it might be interesting if we had another 7-week course just on the sermons and the prayers and discourses of Jesus. Just look at that we could easily fill up 7 weeks, maybe like next fall or something like that. So I don't know, any thoughts on that? We've got a sermon expert here among us, so he could help us a lot with that. So why don't you think about that with me for a week, and then we'll come back to it. And maybe in the fall, look at the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, the 7 woes to the Pharisees. There's all those good sermons that we could look at. Jesus' discourse to his own disciples. There's so many good things to do there. The 7-week thing is a church schedule parameter, and it's hard to fit all this material into it. So with your permission, that's what we'll do, okay? So let's look at the timeline again. We're down to the last week, and we've already looked, wrong button. Yeah, it's this one. We're right over here. We're in the crucifixion week. This is about the end of the 3rd year of Jesus' ministry. About half of it he spent, a little more than half of it he spent in Galilee. Much of the rest of his ministry was in Judea and Perea and those other areas, but now we're in the last week, and he's back in Jerusalem. And last week we looked at Matthew 21, and we looked at the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where Jesus sent his disciples in, and he secured the use of an animal. And Matthew especially ties all of this into prophecy. And the term the Son of David, which gets to be very strong in Matthew 21. So the Jews are proclaiming him to be the Son of David. who was in their minds the apocalyptic manifestation of the return of David's reign. Now, they didn't understand that the same way Jesus did, but that's what they thought of it, and that's why they were saying Hosanna and throwing the palm branches out in front of him. And what's going to follow that is a very tumultuous week of very intense events. In fact, the triumphal entry was on the first day of the week, but the next 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, looked basically like a very long, intensive argument between Jesus and the religious leaders of the Jews. And the intensity of it is rather shocking as you look at how bitter they were and how they had determined in their own minds that they were going to get rid of him by any means necessary. And how he was finally revealing to them, that his disciples, that all of this was going to happen, and this was all a fulfillment of Scripture. So that's where we are. We're in the last week. We did Sunday last time we were together, and now tonight I want us to start with Monday, and you have your outline in front of you there. And you see the events of Monday on there. And let's look at that. Matthew's recording of it is open in front of me, so we'll start there. Mark says basically the same thing. I think they used the same material here. I think Matthew used Mark, I think is what happened here. But if you look at Matthew 21 and go down to verse 12, well, let's do the fig tree first. Let's go over to verse 18, because it says specifically there it was early in the morning. So this is Monday morning. He goes back in, look at the fig tree story, which begins 21:18, and it says, early in the morning, as he was on his way back into the city, he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, may you never bear fruit again. Immediately the tree withered. When the disciples saw this, they were amazed. How did the fig tree wither so quickly, they asked. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but you can also say this to the mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and it will be done. And if you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. Now, Mark's rendition of that is in Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 14. And Mark stretches the timeline out just a little bit more, and it looks like a slightly longer time between the cursing of the fig tree and the fact that the disciples marveled at it. And I've always wondered about this particular miracle, because this is the only time that you see a nature miracle that was, I guess the word is destructive. He actually withered the tree, and that's the only time he did a thing like this. So we are almost forced to ask, why did he do that? What was the real lesson behind this withering of the fig tree? Well, what had happened immediately before that in Matthew was in verse 12 in that same chapter. And it says, Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. Listen to this part. It says, but when the chief priest and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple area, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Do you hear what these children are saying? They asked him. Yes, replied Jesus. Have you never read, from the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise? And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, where he spent the night. So we talked about this cleansing of the temple a bit about 3 weeks ago when we were looking at the Gospel of John, because John also records a temple cleansing early in the ministry of Jesus. So it's likely he did this twice at least. Maybe he did it more than that, but at least 2 times. And we determined at that time that what really bothered him, at least in John, the early version of it, was that these people had commercialized service to God and love for God, because they were doing the exchange of money from one currency to another. They'd set up the rules so that you could only purchase sacrifices in a certain coin. You had to use the coin that they were using. You couldn't use foreign money. And of course, they made a handsome profit when they traded the money. And we talked about that earlier when we talked about John's version of that. But I think what bothered him this time was the reaction of the religious authorities, who were indignant that he was actually healing, and that people were calling him the Son of David. And it was, in this case, the chief priests and the teachers of the law. These were the teaching rabbis and the priestly class who did not like what Jesus was doing. And I think maybe this whole fig tree thing is a symbol. I think it's a symbolic act. And I think what he is saying is that system that the priests and these self-serving teachers of the law had installed in the community, which had assured them a good income and also a very high status in the community. I think what he was saying, that whole system is going to wither because it's not producing good fruit. Now, you don't have to agree with me on that, but in the context of it, it's another one of these rejection narratives where Jesus had come in there and he'd really upset the systems, the social systems that they had in place. They were losing status. He was gaining status. He was changing even their worldviews, their views of God. He was opening up the kingdom to the poor, the lepers, the blind, to women and children, and they didn't like this at all because they had an established system. And in my view of this particular incident on Monday where he cursed the fig tree, what I think's happening there, he's turning that into an image of what's going to happen to that Jewish system, and even in fact the whole temple complex, because as we have noted, he said in 3 days, he said this dual meaning. He said in 3 days all this will be torn down, but I will raise it back up. And he also warned them that the city was going to be destroyed, and it was destroyed by the Romans, by General Titus in 70 A.D. And he was telling this, that all this stuff that you've built is not going to last. It's going to wither. It's going to go away. Now, that's my take on it. You don't have to agree with me. I can't think of any other reason why you'd have this fig tree story right in the middle of the beginning of the last week of his life. You have any thoughts or questions about that? Does the imagery work for you? You know, the temple's going to be torn down a few years later, but the whole system's going to deteriorate. And he came into Jerusalem looking for fruit, and he didn't see any, so the tree withered, just like I think that culture that they were building. That's both good news and bad news to the human race, because what it means is that these cultures that we build up in the big scheme of things, are temporary, and eventually they wither away, and another one comes along and replaces it, and then another and another. And none of them are really permanent. The only thing that's permanent is God and His will, but all these other things are going to fade away. And the cleansing the temple story is very much like what you read in John earlier, and he really objected to the misuse of their national faith and their personal faith for commercial purposes. He did not like that at all, and he very strongly objected to it. He overturned the tables. It's almost as if in this particular case right here, Matthew and Mark, he came in and said, I told you guys once before to get out of here, so I'm turning this, get out. And he was angry, and he pushed the tables aside. By the way, they were selling sacrificial animals, doves in this case it mentions, at very inflated prices. They were getting the profit from selling these sacrificial animals for pilgrims who would come into Jerusalem, and you couldn't carry something like that with you over long distances. Now, I do want to show you an image. Okay, Jeff, can you advance me one slide there? This one is not working. Okay, this is a map of Jerusalem. You can see the temple complex, which is that's the temple complex right there. Bethany's over here, so you'd been over there. That would be maybe a little more than half a mile. And you can see some of the other events we're going to talk about here. The house of Caiaphas, who is the high priest, is here. The Calvary and the tomb are pretty well attested to be up here on the north end of the town. That's one of the better ones. It's a little bit more sure than some of these other sites. Let's see if it'll do it one more time. It did it, Jeff. It worked after you came down here and did that. I have a picture right there. I'm gonna be right there. I got you. Thank you. Use that one. Thank you, Jeff. That is a fairly recent picture of the temple area, and the reason I show you that is that this wall right here is called the Western Wall, and it's not really even a part of the temple. It was more of a retention wall. The situation, the geologic situation is this is a hill, and that's they call it the Dome of the Rock. The temple was up here, and the hill was not quite big enough to build the temple complex, so they built retaining walls all the way around it and to make a larger platform. And Herod the Great, the very same one that tried to kill Jesus as an infant, rebuilt the Jewish temple and made it a very grand temple. The one they had before that was substandard by everyone's view. So Herod thought he would win the loyalty and respect of the other Jewish people by building them a bigger temple. So that was a retaining wall. That right there is the only thing that's left, that retaining wall, from the period in which Jesus actually lived. He probably would have seen that wall. That's called the Western Wall. And it's also in Jewish tradition today called the retaining wall, or the wailing wall rather, not the retaining wall, but the wailing wall. And you probably have seen pictures of them on television about this time of the year going there to say prayers. Valdez, you said you'd been there. Have you seen the wailing wall? Right. They write a prayer, and you roll it up and you put it between the stones up there. And I have not been there, but that's the only thing that's left, because the Romans did a pretty thorough job of destroying all that. So all the things that Jesus saw, you would not see today, except perhaps that. That would be, probably the only thing that was there. So that was Monday. He cursed the fig tree, cleansed the temple. He did these healings in the temple, and those places are pretty much under the ground. What they did then and still do to this very day in that part of the world is that when a building gets really old, they tear it down, and since it's made of rocks or stone, they take that and reuse it, build a new building out of it. So all that stuff was recycled and reused in different ways. Okay, that's about what we know about Monday. Now let's go over a day to Tuesday. And what you see on Tuesday is a new series of events. In Matthew 21:19, he has to explain the fig tree thing to his disciples, and we talked about that just a little bit. He went into a discussion of faith, and he said, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, said you can move a mountain, do all kinds of wonderful things. Now, I don't doubt for the slightest moment that God could move a mountain from one continent to another continent in an instant if he wanted to do that. But my question has always been, why would he do that? What would be the purpose behind it? So I think when it talks about moving mountains and all that sort of thing, I've always taken that to be a figure of speech in which he's saying you can do seemingly impossible things through prayer. Not that you'd want to move a mountain. I mean, why would anybody want to move, unless you're building an interstate highway or something, why would you move a mountain? There's no purpose in that. But he's telling his disciples, you're entering into a period of time in which your prayers will avail very much. They're very, very, very important. And that's the way I've always understood that. And once again, you don't have to agree with me on any of these things that I say, but that's the way that I've seen it. And that's in Matthew 21, also Mark 20. Now, from that point on, for the rest of Tuesday, Wednesday, and really even Thursday, it's just a big, long argument. And it involved a good deal of teaching. In Matthew 21:23, we see one of the opening phases of this argument. And I want you to notice as we read through Matthew who it is that's bringing these issues to Jesus. Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priest and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? It's always interesting to me when people say, by what authority are you doing that? What does that say about these people, the chief priest and it says the chief priest and the teachers, the primary chief, the elders of the people? What were they really saying when they challenged his authority? He's in there healing people and teaching people, and it's by what authority? Who told you could do this? So what were they really saying? What do you think's behind that? I think this is what's behind it. They didn't give him authority to do it, and they didn't like it one bit that he was in there teaching this way. What did he say about his own authority in this passage and others? He said, God sent me here to say these things. They're really, in a way, confessing that they did not accept his claims about himself, because he'd already told them. He said, I'm just bringing you the words that God gave me. And they being very defensive about their position in the society, did not approve of that, didn't like it, and they recognized that they were going to lose something by letting him do this. And he answered them, in this case, with a trick question. They were trying to trick him, and he fired one right back at them. And he said, okay, I'll ask you a question. If you can answer my question, I'll answer yours. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or from men? And he reversed the trap and turned it back on them, because no matter what he said about authority, they would have used that against him. So he turned it back around, and he asked them about John the Baptist. Now, the Jewish people had really admired John the Baptist and had appreciated his teachings. So they liked John the Baptist. So these leaders who were challenged also by John the Baptist, they didn't get along very well either, because John didn't listen to their authority. If they had said, well, it was from God, well, Jesus would have said, well, why didn't you follow him? Why weren't you baptized if he's from God? If they said, well, it was just from men, then the people would have been outraged at them. So he really took the same trap that they were trying to lay for him and turned it back around on them in this particular passage. He says, John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or from men? They discussed it among themselves, and they said, if we say from heaven, he will ask, why didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, they were afraid of the people, for the people held that John was a prophet. So Jesus was really exposing the weakness of their argument. So they took the approach in their answer that all good psychologists use. All good psychologists say this. It says, when they answered Jesus, we don't know. Redders do that too, except they rarely say we don't know. But we don't know. We don't know if it's from God or from men. And then Jesus said, well, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. You couldn't answer my question, so I'm not going to answer yours. Now that really set the week off on a high note, right? I mean, they had this first big argument. And then he told them a series of parables which were intended, it was designed to illustrate their rejection of him, and the fact that the people of the street, the Amharetz, as they called them, were coming to the kingdom, but they weren't. So let's look at the parable of the two sons, which is in verse 28. What do you think? There was a man who had two sons. He went to the first and said, son, go and work today in the vineyard. I will not, he answered. But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. He answered him, I will, sir, but he did not go. Which of the two did what his father wanted? The first, they answered. Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you to show you the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you did not repent and believe him. Do you get the idea that maybe by this point that Jesus has already given up on them? That he recognizes that they're not going to believe. And he challenges them with this. To the teachers of the law and the chief priests, he's saying that the tax collectors, the most hated people of the society, and the prostitutes that they probably frequented but looked down upon are going to enter the kingdom of heaven before you enter the kingdom of heaven, because when they hear God speak, they repent and come to God, but you don't. So the argument's getting worse, isn't it? Can you see the intensity building in this week? he said, John came to you to show you the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him. He's sort of saying, you're not going to believe me either. And if you look around, the tax collectors like Matthew, who's writing this, came to the kingdom, and the prostitutes, like the woman caught in adultery, they're coming to the kingdom, but you're not. And then he gives them another parable in verse 33. He says, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, put a watchtower, and then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect the fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? And this is what the priest replied. He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants and will give them their share of the crop at the harvest time. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the capstone? The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. Now get this in verse 45. When the chief priests and Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. Can you sense even more intensity? Here Jesus gives two short parables illustrating how the religious leadership of that particular culture rejected the Son. And Jesus even prophesied a little. He said, they will kill the Son. He knew what was coming. And there's another one in chapter 22 right there where he talks about that. We've discussed that at quite some length. Mark, in chapter 11, all the way through chapter 12, verse 37, you see this long series of arguments between Jesus and the religious leaders. You see it in Luke chapter 20. Let's go over and get Luke's version of it. So let's go over to Luke chapter 20, and because Luke adds some really interesting things. You get the same parables, but you get a couple of things that you don't see in Matthew. In Luke chapter 20, it says, one day as he was teaching the people in the temple courts and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and teachers of the law together with the elders came to him. Tell us by what authority you're doing these things. And they said, who gave you this authority? He replied, I'll ask you a question. And then you get the same thing that we saw in Matthew there. And that gave them the same answer. The parable of the tenants is recorded there. But there's another little story about paying taxes to Caesar, which you get in verse 20, chapter 20, verse 20. Look down there. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be honest. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So the spies questioned him, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So you get another one of these trick questions here. Now I want you to notice in in these spies, this obsequious bowing and scraping, we know that you're from God and we know that you're right. And they try this excessive flattery. We know you'll tell us the truth. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And no matter how he answered that, he was going to get himself in trouble. It was one of those things where you can't say either way. If he said, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, they would try to turn that around and turn the Jewish people against him because they hated the tax collectors and the tax, and they didn't think much of the Romans being there at all. So they were trying to get Jesus to lose his Jewish audience. But if he had said, sure, go ahead and pay taxes, or don't pay your taxes to Caesar, they could have gone to the Roman authorities. They could have gone to Pilate and said, this man Jesus is telling us not to pay taxes, and that would have gotten him in trouble with them. So it was one of those questions. And I don't think you had to be a Messiah with divine powers to see through the shallowness of their question. I mean, they were so obvious the way it's described here. And he said something very interesting. He said, "Why don't you guys have a coin?" And he held it up and said, "Whose picture is on that?" And so Jesus said, "Then give Caesar what's Caesar's and give God what belongs to God." And they were unable to trap him. This goes down to verse 26. They were unable to trap him in what he said there in public, and they were astonished by his answer, and they became silent. Now look at who comes next. Okay, he's flummoxed the chief priest and the teachers. Then he had these spies, and then here come the Sadducees. And the Sadducees did not get along with the chief priest and the teachers, and so the Sadducees come along. They'd been conspiring together because they all felt threatened. So look at verse 27. Some of the Sadducees who say there's no resurrection came to Jesus with a question. They said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaves a wife, no children, the man must marry the widow and have children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers, and I'll abbreviate this. Each one of them died, and each one of them married the next one in the succession married the widow. And they said, well, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And remember, the Sadducees didn't even believe in the resurrection. And what they were trying to do was to get him to say something so utterly stupid that they could turn their crowd away from him. And he said, you don't understand the power of God, and you don't understand the resurrection. In heaven, there's no need for marriage. That's a different level, plane of existence. And Moses said that even the dead will rise. I mean, so you guys are ignoring the power and the law of God. And some of the teachers of the law responded, well said, teacher, and no one dared ask him any more questions. So you've got, Mark's version, he mentions Herodians. You got Herodians, Sadducees, Pharisees, teachers of the law, the priests. So who's against Jesus? Who is that? That's like the top of the nation, isn't it? The priest, the high priest. They're against him. And they were trying to get rid of it. So they finally gave up on that particular approach. And we talked last week about Matthew 23, about the woes to the Pharisees. He launched into a vicious sermon and exposing the sins of the Pharisees in Matthew 23. We talked about that. Mark mentions a little interesting story where there's a widow that comes by at that time, and all these big shots are out there, the priests and leaders, and everybody's putting in their offerings in the treasury, and a widow comes by with just 2 little old coins that don't even amount to a penny. And Jesus said she gave more than all those rich guys that put in a big bag of money. And you see that story in there. So what he's saying is that a genuine heart who does the right thing for the right reason is more precious to God than somebody who does the right thing for the wrong reason. One time in an much earlier ministry, it didn't happen here. I lived in Georgia for a while and enjoyed it greatly. It was a good experience. But we were at a little country church way out on the east side of Atlanta. And we did all the things that little country churches did back in those days. And one day we had a church picnic after church on Sunday. We covered up the picnic tables all around, and we had, a huge crowd of people for us, probably 100 or 150 people out there, and we were sharing food, having a picnic. And this very nice looking young man drives up in an expensive car, very well dressed, and nobody had any idea who this man was. So he came in, he started sitting down at tables, shaking hands, talking to people, went from table to table, met everybody, just the friendliest guy you'd ever want to see. Obviously well educated, so I remember going over to him and I said, "I haven't met you." I told him my name and got his name. He said, "I'm so-and-so, and I'm running for Congress in this district." And he said, I just like to get out and associate with all the church people. We'd never seen him before that, and we never saw him after that. But he happened to be running for Congress in that district. So in the back of my suspicious mind, what did I think? I said, "Oh, okay, he's out trying to stir up votes." Now, he was doing the right kind of thing. He was friendly and cordial and was associating with believers and sharing food and all that sort of thing. And I'm not the judge of any man or woman, but was he doing the right thing for the right reason? You be the judge of that. What do you? I don't know. Have you ever seen anything like that? Somebody who does the right kind of thing, but they're doing it for a reason other than, I think, what God had in mind. And that's why the widow's mite, the poor widow comes up and drops in a penny or less than a penny. Jesus said she's blessed because she gave out of her poverty. She had nothing to give, but she loved God and wanted to participate in this temple treasury. And of course, the chief priest and teachers of the law wouldn't pay any attention at all to that. There's an interesting story in John 12, which happened about this time on Monday. So if you want to go over there to the Gospel of John, and you look at chapter 12, you'll see a pretty interesting little story, which I think it's interesting to me that John is the one who remembered this and who recorded it. Look in John 12, verse 20. And it says, "Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the feast. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee." The reason they did that, because there were a lot of Greeks up there, and they thought they might get a good hearing from him. And they said, "Sir," they said, "we would like to see Jesus." So he didn't quite know what to do. So he went to tell Andrew, and Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. And here's what Jesus said: "The hour for the Son of Man to be glorified has come." Why? Because Greeks were coming to see him. What was he anticipating right there? What was Jesus thinking? Here's Jesus in this big Jewish crowd at the Passover, and here come these Greeks and said, "We'd like to see Jesus too." What does that mean? Where's that going? What do you think? What do you think, Valdez? What does that mean?
It's great commissions for the Gentiles also, for the Jewish people.
Exactly. He's about to announce that the kingdom is just right on the verge. I mean, it hadn't happened that day, but he said it's time for the Son of Man to be glorified. The kingdom's going to open up to all of these people, not just the Jews. And I find it very interesting that John's the one that recorded this visit of the Greeks there on that day. Now, we don't get a whole lot of reaction to that. There's a voice from heaven that appears in this story where God speaks that Jesus is about to be glorified. And Jesus said, "This voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself." He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. And you get, the only reaction you get there from the crowd is in verse 34. It says, "The crowd spoke up, 'We have heard from the law that the Christ will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man?'" That's not a genuine question. They knew who the Son of Man was. They knew that figure because it was a part of their literature. Then Jesus told them, "You're going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you still have the light before darkness overtakes you." There's that light darkness theme that Dwayne talked about in his sermon this morning. And it says down the page there just a little bit, "When he had finished speaking, Jesus left and hid himself from them." So this whole thing is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And look at verse 37. After Jesus had done all these miraculous signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet. "Lord, who has believed our message? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" For this reason they could not believe, because as Isaiah says elsewhere, "He has blinded their eyes and deadened their hearts, so they can neither see with their eyes nor understand with their hearts, nor turn, and I would heal them." Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. So John is saying that even this rejection is a fulfillment of the prophecy. We talked about this a little 2 or 3 weeks ago. Is it possible for a person to get to the point with anything, a matter of faith or anything else, where you just will not or cannot believe it? Can you get to that point where no matter how much evidence you see, you're just not going to believe it? Do we deny the truth that's right in front of us? Do we do that? We do, don't we? I mean, it's staring us in the face, and we say, "It can't be, can't be, can't be." And we find 10,000 reasons why we don't have to believe it, and it's right there. It's just right there in front of us. Spencer talked about that 2 weeks ago in his sermon about being blind spiritually. You can be blind physically, but it's worse to be blind spiritually. These people had reached a point where it didn't matter what Jesus had done. Right in front of them, they still would not believe him. They rejected him completely. They were blind. They could not and would not see it. And it said, "And Jesus left them and hid himself from them." Now, that was apparently on Tuesday, there are some who place some of these events that I'm about to mention on Wednesday. And there's some New Testament scholars that I respect very much, and I've read several books on this, and some of them will say this was Tuesday and this was Wednesday. And I'm not good enough at that to know which is right. So either Tuesday or Wednesday, there were some more things. There's some of them that I respect very much who say that we don't really have any record of what happened on Wednesday. We don't really know. But those would be predictions of the cross. Probably in the house of Simon the leper, you have Mary who anointed him. Let's see, John 12. Since we're in John, most of you are in John. Okay, look over at verse 1 and 2 in chapter 12. 6 days before Passover, he arrived in Bethany. Okay, so Bethany was just about half a mile outside the city. And it says that here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on his feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, it was a custom of the host to arrange for the washing of feet, but not like that. That was over the top. Usually it was just water and a towel, but because that's what Jesus did on Thursday. But this time, Mary poured out this expensive perfume. And John is the one who remembered this and talked about it. And some of the people were there just to see Lazarus, because, remember, he'd been raised from the dead just before this, a little while before that. Look down at verse 10. So the chief priest made plans to kill Lazarus as well. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. Here you've got a man who had been raised from the dead by Jesus. And that we already know that the chief priest had made plans to kill Jesus, but they were going to kill Lazarus, the man who had been raised from the dead. Now, can you imagine the depth of the rejection in those people? What were they thinking? That boggles my mind. I don't even know what to say about that. Their hatred was that deep. Sure, this man can raise the dead, and that's pretty impressive. But even if he can do that, he'll change everything for us, so we got to get rid of him. They valued their position in society and their view of the role of Israel more than they valued a man who could raise the dead. And I'm firmly convinced that there's a lot of people around us who say they don't believe, and I'm very much convinced that they really don't want to believe, and they'll find reasons not to, and it's going to take something that changes the heart on the inside, or they won't believe it. They just won't believe it. I don't know. Help me out with that, guys. How could they do that? How could they say, we got to get rid of Lazarus too? What's that saying?
I think the power of evil is real, just as much as the real of the power of the love of God. And if you open yourself up to the power of evil, you can become pure evil. And maybe that's what they did. We can't look into the heart of people, but we have crimes that are committed right today by people. They're just beyond comprehension. It isn't a matter of, well, I can't fit that into my paradigm, so I'm going to shoot you. Well, it's beyond that.
Yeah, it is. It is beyond that.
And I think that's, in my opinion, anyway. We had a couple in our subdivision. It's on my mind. He shot his wife, killed her, murdered her, and then committed suicide. And they just decided life is not worth putting up with in old age, because you get disease and pain and so forth. And they were just unpleasant people. They always were. And I try to understand that, and I just think we can go into a realm of just pure evil. And he takes his gun and kills his wife. I can't comprehend that, except there has to be some supernatural evil power beyond just being a human being and being mistaken.
Well, you get a hint of that supernatural power in the betrayal events with Judas, and it says, and Satan came into him. I don't know what the rest of you, I read that. What? This man had been raised from the dead. Wouldn't you have at least like to talk to him and see what he, what he saw and what he could tell us? And they said, we got to kill him, because if we don't, people will believe. It's mind-boggling. Okay, now along that unfortunate theme, let's go back to Matthew and look at chapter 26, and we'll just read a little bit about the betrayal by Judas here. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" So he was not any better than the ones that wanted to kill Jesus and Lazarus, was he? Now, I don't understand Judas, and I have more questions about him than I have answers. There are some people, and I've heard this argued pretty passionately, that somewhere, this is about Tuesday, Wednesday of that week. There are some people who thought that Judas was one of those zealots, which was a radical political party that wanted independence from Rome and wanted to provoke a revolution and get rid of the Romans. And Judas was the only Judean member of the 12. All the others were Galileans. So Judas had stayed with Jesus and perhaps believed in his own way that Jesus was the Messiah, because he'd seen all these things. But what Judas wanted was this political rebellion. And I've heard people argue this, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard people argue that Judas was trying to force Jesus' hand. He was going to betray him over to the chief priest that were trying to kill him, and Judas knew they were trying to kill him. And Judas thought, well, if I force him over there, then he'll restore the kingdom to Israel. He'll have to defend himself and bring about the kingdom. I've heard others say Judas was just greedy, and he really didn't believe. I don't know which is right. I don't know which. I mean, it's terrible either way. But for whatever reason, he said, tell me what I need to do. How much will you pay me? So they paid him 30 pieces of silver, which I am told that was the price of a slave. 30 pieces of silver is what it cost to buy a household servant, 30 pieces of silver. And he arranged that he would find Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and give him a kiss, and that would identify Jesus so that the temple police wouldn't arrest the wrong one. So that was a betrayal. Now, was that Tuesday or Wednesday? I don't know. I've seen it both ways. You probably have too. In one sense, it really doesn't matter if it was Tuesday or Wednesday. Some people say Jesus went into seclusion on Wednesday and at someone's house because he had a lot of supporters. Other people say, well, he was still around here and there. So let's go over to Thursday real quick. Thursday was the Passover Meal, and the Passover Meal was a long-established tradition in the Jewish faith that celebrated their deliverance from Pharaoh in Egypt when they had all the plagues and all that, and then the Jews were to eat a meal that didn't include any leaven as a symbol of you got to do it fast. You don't have time to let the dough rise. It has to be unleavened bread, and it's a very ritualized meal. And it got more and more ritualized as they went on down through the years, and they kept adding things to it. After the prophets, they left a plate open for Elijah at the Passover meal. So however many people you had that many plates plus one for Elijah, because Elijah is supposed to come before the Messiah. And you kept hoping that he would come that day and partake of that plate. There were several cups that were involved in this Passover, and there were several very highly ritualized dishes by the time Jesus came around. I remember one year here at Woodlawn, we brought in what I'll call a Messianic Jew, and he celebrated a Passover meal for us. We went over in the old fellowship hall, and he set up the meal, and he went through it step by step and told us at what point Jesus did those things, what we think. And that was very informative. And they even like to describe the stripes on the bread that's put on a griddle, and it's grilled and stripes. Andy, have you done that? Have you had a Passover? That was a really good experience, because it helped us understand this quite a bit. And there was a lot of preparation involved in it. So Jesus makes the preparation. If you look at, what are we in? Matthew, still in Matthew, look at chapter 26, and you see the celebration of that meal. If you look down to, start about verse 17, on the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, this was a Thursday, the disciples came to Jesus and said, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? And he told them to go into the city and he told them what to do. And he went to this room, which has been called the upper room. And let's see if this will work. Yeah, I showed you this last week, but that's the room that is used today over there. There's actually a church there around it, as there is everything else. There is that the right room? I don't know if it is or not. Probably not. That's probably 3rd, 4th century, but there's a very strong tradition that that's the room. And in this Passover meal, they would recline around the table, and Jesus went through this meal, and you see the story of it in the texts that I have given you there. And he said, "Go into the city, and a certain man." And tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time has come. And this is somebody who's following Jesus, somebody that knew him, and he had this room ready. Now that room is a little bit secluded, and that's one of the reasons that people think that could be it, because Jesus was at very great physical risk. They were trying to kill him, and they'd already arranged temple police. He'd already been betrayed and all that sort of thing. And that this room's a little bit hard to get to. It wasn't in a place where people would see him. They had the meal, and they were going through the typical Jewish rituals with that very ritualized meal. It was a big meal too, by the way. It was not a small meal. It was not a cracker in a little cup like this is food. Lots of food. And they began to do these things, and Jesus announced that he washed their feet. He took the role of the servant and washed their feet. Then he announced to them, and he said, one of you's going to betray me, but not to worry, this has all been predicted. And they were shocked, and every one of them said, am I the one? Am I the and I've always thought about that when I read that. Is it I? every one of them realized that they had within them the capability to deny Jesus. Every one of them recognized that, but only one of them did it. It was Judas. And it says Jesus took bread and he gave thanks and he broke it. There was one of the rituals where you'd actually break off some of that and you'd dip it in this stew-like stuff. They called it a sop. And they would sop. And Jesus said, the one that I do this is the one that will betray me. And he gave it to Judas, who was sitting in the place of the chief guest at the Passover. And he gave it to Judas. And as our preacher told us this morning, that he told Judas, go out and what you're going to do, go on about it, get it done, get it quickly. And in verse 27, it says, he took the cup and he gave thanks and offered it to them, saying, drink from it. This is the blood of the covenant. And that phrase, the blood of the covenant, is a phrase that they would have recognized because back in Exodus, they would remember the time when Moses came down from the mountain and they butchered a bull, and they had a large bowl full of the blood of this bull, and Moses sprinkled this blood all over the people. Gallons of it, and he was throwing it all over the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant, of that covenant. And Jesus used the same phrase with this cup that was part of the Passover meal. He said, this is the blood of the covenant. Same phrase that they would have recognized. He turned the Passover meal completely upside down. He shocked everybody when he said, this is my body and this is my blood. That's a messianic claim. Only the Messiah would say that. Because they were accustomed to, they knew exactly what was to be said with each part of the meal and each cup. There were four cups. And they'd ritualized that. They knew what was supposed to be said. He didn't say that. He said, this is my body. This is my blood. And he called it the blood of the covenant. And going back to this denial thing, Peter was there, and Peter said, I'll never deny you. And Jesus said, before the rooster crows, you will. And he did. You're familiar with that story. Peter actually denied him. And Jesus then gave him a farewell. And John remembers a lot of that and records part of that the three synoptic gospels did not record. There's one that I wish we had time to talk about, but I'll save that for a future course. And it's Jesus' priestly prayer in John 17, which happened in here somewhere in this period of time, where Jesus prayed that his disciples who followed him would be one as he and the Father were one. And that was a very important verse for the movement of which this church is a part. Alexander Campbell talked about that, didn't he? The priestly prayer of Jesus, where he prayed that we would be one. Stan's an expert at restoration documents, but that was very important thinking in the early days of our movement, that the church would be one. The ecclesia would be one. The kingdom would be one. So we'll come back to that at a later time. Now, after that, Jesus they left there, and they went out to this secluded place. It was a garden called Gethsemane. They probably had been there before. It's probably a place they knew. And Judas knew that too, because he'd probably been there for prayer meetings before. So they went out there, and Jesus was in great agony of spirit because he knew what was going to happen. And you can see the things that are going there on Thursday. The crowd came up. These were temple police. These were Jewish police. They were not Romans. And they found them there in that Garden of Gethsemane. And the disciples were asleep because it was a very long, hard day, and naturally fatigue took place of them. Peter drew a sword and hacked off the ear of a servant named Malchus, and Jesus healed the man's ear and said, "Put your sword away," he said, "I could call in 12 legions of angels." And they arrested Jesus, and they took him to the house of Caiaphas, who was John says they took him to the house of Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. I don't know if they were looking for Caiaphas or if they wanted to check with the father-in-law first and then go to Caiaphas. And they took him to the high priest and said, "Okay, we got him. We got this Jesus. We found him. We've arrested him. It's dark. Nobody saw us except the disciples out there. What are we going to do with him?" So they started a trial process. And I see that I'm short on time, so we're going to have to come back here. But the trial was in stages. They went to the house of the high priest. They had another before the whole Sanhedrin, the 70. And I want to talk about that more, so I'll come back to it next week. They tried to get a capital charge on him in the only thing that they were allowed to do capital punishment. The Jews were under the thumb of the Romans, and the Romans have said, you let us deal with capital punishment. They said, "We'll make an exception. We know you Jews are so picky about your temple that if somebody tries to deface your temple, we will let you have the right of capital punishment if somebody defaces or blasphemes your temple." But that's it. So they were trying to get a charge against Jesus to say that he had blasphemed the temple itself. They could have killed him right there on the spot, and the Romans wouldn't have said anything about it. But they couldn't get it to stick. So they had to go to Pilate. And then they made up other charges, but we'll talk about that in detail. Pilate brought in Herod Antipas, who was the figurehead king of the Jews, and he was puzzled by Jesus, and he sent him back to Pilate, and Pilate said, "What do you want me to do with him?" And he said, "I'll make you a deal." He said, I've got one of your, or several of your people in here that we are going to execute. I'll release somebody to you just as a present. You want this guy Barabbas, who was a murderer and an insurrectionist, or do you want Jesus? And they said, "We want Barabbas, crucify Jesus." So they're once again claiming the responsibility. They said, "Let his blood be on our head and upon that of our children." So it went that way. And I'm running out of time for tonight, but we'll come back to that next time. We'll pick up at that trial. So he did the Passover meal, went to the garden. You can read. I've given you the text there to read. And then they went through this. It was kind of a show trial. They knew what they were going to do. They were going to find a way to get rid of him. And they almost bungled the whole thing. They almost didn't get it because Pilate didn't want any part of it. We'll talk about Pilate a little bit more too, who he was and how he was involved in all of this. So I'm going to pause there and start again next week at that point. So keep this sheet that you have. This is it. So just keep that one for next week, and we'll come back to the very late night Thursday and early Friday morning trials. We'll start there. Any questions or comments about this? Thoughts? What kind of people were they?
Just like us.
Yeah, just like us.
There's one thing about this, though, that I know they were evil, the Pharisees, the chief priests.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Mark, you know this from your own academic studies. We have to organize to get certain things done.
Right.
In order to do that, you have to give up some of your freedom and delegate authority. And so when that's successful, You defend that at all cost. And he had not resurrected from the dead yet, and they really didn't have the evidence that he was the promised Messiah, the descendant of Abraham. So I always give the Pharisees a little bit of, forgiveness there.
Yeah.
I don't know what you call it, but I can't condemn them 100%.
Well, the question is, could we do the same thing? And yes, we would do it differently than they did it, but we could end up doing the same thing. We'd put him in a mental institution. That's what we would have done. Locked him away and put him on Thorazine and zoned him out. We can't deal with this guy. It's very sobering, isn't it? And we're approaching that week in the year, so we'll come back there. I'm sorry we're not making progress, but this stuff's just too important to race past it.
We have a homework for next week.
Yeah. Just what did I say? I said read the narratives about the Passover week. Reread those, because it will really help you. I can't say everything from up here in the amount of time we have, so if you've got that as background, it'll really help you read those, help you understand it. Okay, well, let's say a prayer. Father in heaven, you loved us enough to go through all of this, to send your Son, and because of it, we're saved. And we meet in his name. Amen.